He is restoration campaigner, managing trustee, Junglescapes, Charitable Trust, and board member of Society for Ecological Restoration. Ramesh Venkatraman has been actively engaged in ecological restoration since 2007. He is the managing trustee of Junglescapes Charitable Trust, a non-profit organization engaged in restoration of degraded forest ecosystems in Bandipur National Park in Karnataka. The restoration is carried out through a community participative model. Until now, over 3,500 acres of degraded forests have been restored to healthy wildlife habitats. Ramesh is on the board of directors of the Society for Ecological Restoration, called SER, since 2017. He is also a member of UNFAO Force Task on Capacity Building for the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. At SER, he is the chair of an ad hoc committee on biodiversity, equity, and inclusion. Ramesh is a member of the expert committee on invasive species constituted by the High Courts of Madras. He is also a certified ecological restoration practitioner, the first Indian to obtain this certification. He has been a speaker, presenter at many international and national conferences. He writes regularly on restoration topics. He also runs a training program on ecological restoration in collaboration with SER and VNCA Pune. We welcome you, sir. I think you can take over now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neha, for the kind introduction. I will now share my screen. Is my screen visible, please?
Yes, sir. And it is full screen.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important and contextual conference. I will try to share some of my thoughts on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration in the context of the global, local, and the stakeholder perspectives. Before we get into this main topic, let us look at a fundamental question as to why ecological restoration has assumed much greater significance now than in the last 5 to 6 decades than in the past. We are seeing in the last 5 to 6 decades that our natural ecosystems are facing a rate of damage or degradation, which is much higher or much faster than the ability of these ecosystems to recover naturally. The conventional conservation thinking is that if you leave a damaged ecosystem alone, it will recover on its own, but we are observing that this is not happening. And therefore, conservation alone is no longer sufficient. And if we want to reverse the situation of a net loss to that of a net gain, we need to carry out fairly widespread restoration efforts. So what has changed in the last 50 to 60 years, which has led us to this situation? The important factors like population growth, rapid industrialization, changes in lifestyle from savings-oriented lifestyles to high consumption-oriented lifestyles, and a high focus on GDP. All these factors put together have led to a level of extraction of natural resources, which is much higher than the ability of nature to revive, or for these resources to revive or regenerate. The other big factor is infrastructure focus. Ever since the Big Depression in the US, most governments believe that massive investments in infrastructure is the best way to pull economies in trouble out of trouble. So this has a very big negative impact on ecosystems globally and in India as well. And this is what has led to the UN to declare the decade of 2021 to 2030 as that of ecosystem restoration. This was adopted by the UN General Assembly 3 years back, and it basically proclaimed 2021-30 as the decade on ecosystem restoration with two principal aims. The first aim is to support scaling up efforts to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. And the second objective is to raise awareness of the importance of successful ecosystem restoration. You can see they're using the word ecosystem restoration here and not ecological restoration. There is a very thin dividing line between the two. Ecosystem restoration, we're generally referring to the outcome at a very landscape level, whereas ecological restoration largely refers to the process of restoration, and it is more at a local project site level. The UN decade has twin goals of recovery of ecosystem health and biodiversity, along with enhancement of human well-being in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And you can see the logo of the UN decade, which has the earth, the vegetation, and the water. And on top of that, you have the heart, which is the human health. The UN has come out with 10 principles for the decade. And many of these principles touch upon these dual aspects of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, along with the improvement in human health, social equity and fairness, and also the socio-economic conditions of the different parts of the world. So it's a very holistic kind of approach that the UN has taken. What do we understand by the term ecological restoration? And how is it different from the other approaches that we are quite familiar with, like afforestation and reforestation? This is the definition of ecological restoration, which is part of the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration, published by SCR. The second edition came out in 2019. It defines ecological restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So you can observe that we are not trying to kind of recreate an ecosystem. What we are trying to do is to facilitate the recovery of the ecosystem functions that help the ecosystem recover on its own. So it's more a facilitating role than a recreation role. As compared to afforestation and reforestation, which are mostly about planting trees, ecological restoration applies to very diverse ecosystems. Many of these ecosystems do not have trees. So restoration applies to aquatic ecosystems like lakes and rivers, or to terrestrial ecosystems like deserts and grasslands, which do not have much of tree cover. And even within areas with tree cover, like forests, you have forest types like dry deciduous forests or thorn scrub forests, which do not have a closed tree canopy. So they are not dominated by trees, and there are very large open areas in those kinds of forest types. Again, forestation and reforestation are very top-down activities about going and planting trees wherever there is a piece of open land or wherever there is a degraded piece of land, without looking at the underlying root causes of degradation. Whereas ecological restoration is a much more holistic activity aimed at recovery of multiple ecosystem parameters or attributes. So we are trying to revive the soil health, the hydrological functioning. We are trying to improve the richness and abundance of native flora and fauna. We are trying to reinstate gene flows between sites and also stabilize the microclimate. So it's a very holistic approach, and it's based on three fundamental principles. The first is that of ecosystem integrity, which means we are very cautious not to alter an ecosystem type in the process of restoration. So if we are trying to restore a grassland, we try to restore it back to a grassland and not plant trees and convert it into a woody forest. And the second principle is that of ecological resilience. So resilience means the ability of the ecosystem to withstand future disturbances. And therefore, the focus of restoration is to build the resilience of the site rather than just try to do a cosmetic effort of planting trees. And resilience is based on all the natural functions which happen within an ecosystem. The third is the principle of optimal intervention, where the degree of restoration effort or intervention that we put in is directly proportionate to the degree of degradation or damage that has happened. It is inversely proportionate to the residual resilience that is left on the site. The other important factor is that restoration covers both natural and cultural landscapes, and that is what we call the restoration continuum. So you could have restoration happening in natural wilderness areas like forests or oceans. You could have restoration happening in semi-natural or semi-cultural landscapes. For example, rivers and lakes restoration projects, they go through both natural areas and through human-dominated areas, or you could have restoration in purely cultural landscapes. We have good examples of restoration of sacred groves, village water bodies, or even biodiversity areas within urban cities. How has ecological restoration evolved as a discipline globally? It's a relatively new discipline. It's about 40 years old because it started at the same time that the degradation started accelerating. So it's a fairly new discipline compared to other disciplines like conservation biology, which are much older. It is well established in some parts of the world like North America and Australia. It is reasonably well established in South America and Europe. But in the other parts of the world, it is just beginning to get established. Over the years, multiple branches and specializations have come up. If you look at the various branches of ecological restoration, we have research happening on restoration methods. There is science, which comes out with various guidelines on restoration. There is policy, which is guiding countries and governments on restoration policy. There is restoration education, where a number of universities offer courses on ecological restoration. There are a number of practitioners who carry out restoration on the ground. And then there's communication through journals and other media of communication. There are a number of specializations also that have come up. There are three types of specializations. One is process-based specialization. For example, you have people specializing in seed-based restoration. And there are others who are practicing assisted natural regeneration, which is more like a nature-based solution for restoration. You also have ecosystem-based specialization. So you could have people specializing on grasslands and somebody specializing in highly challenging restoration projects like coral reef restoration, which is just starting to come up now. You could have degradation-based specialization again. There are people across the world specializing on management of invasive species. And there are others who are specializing in very difficult restoration scenarios like contaminated sites or mining sites. And even within these specializations, you could have subspecializations. So you could have within grassland restoration, some people working on prairie grasslands in North America. You could have people working on savannas in Africa, and those working on grasslands in India. So each of these is very unique. It has its own challenges, and the methods that you use might differ from place to place or geography to geography. A number of standards have come up over the years. We have the second edition of the International Principles, which I spoke about just now. The IUCN has published guidelines on restoration for protected areas, and there are specific guidelines coming up for specific ecosystems like mangroves or shellfish reefs. Let's now look at the UN decade in the Indian context, and I'll try to present a stakeholder-based analysis. What is the degradation scenario in India? We don't have an inventory of degradation in India available. So at a very conservative estimate, 40 to 50% of India's ecosystems we feel are degraded and in need of restoration. And this covers a very wide array of ecosystems. I have listed some of them here, a combination of aquatic, intermediate, and terrestrial ecosystems. There are some other very sophisticated and fragile ecosystems not mentioned here, like sand dunes. Most of our sand dunes are disappearing because of various reasons. And all of this is led by high population and anthropogenic pressures. There are also high developmental pressures. And there is also widespread presence of invasive alien species in both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems in India. What is the status of restoration as a discipline in India? It's a relatively nascent or new discipline in India. If you look at most of the projects happening on the ground, they are about 10 to 15 years old. So we are quite young in terms of restoration as a discipline. The number of projects which we can call as genuine ecological restoration projects are quite few. There are not too many projects which you can call as genuine restoration projects. And the majority are small projects. If you look at terrestrial restoration projects, they are ranging from 100 acres to 500 acres. So they're not very large projects compared to what is happening in other parts of the world. And there are not many projects. Many people are attempting tree planting drives, Miyawaki, etc. But if you want to look at genuine, scientifically sound and rigorous restoration projects, there are not too many that you can observe. So if you look at this situation, we need a well-planned, strategic, scaled up and integrated response to our degradation challenges. As compared to the ad hoc and small size response that we have now, we need an integrated and scaled up response rather than sporadic attempts. And if restoration has to succeed, and we have to achieve the goals set out by the UN Decade Declaration, we need the involvement and support and active engagement of multiple stakeholders. So I have tried to list the key stakeholders here. We have the government, which is responsible for policy making. We have the scientific community, which includes researchers. We have the entire education system. We have restoration practitioners, indigenous communities, very important part of the restoration scenario, funding agencies, and climate change managers. So let's look at the role that each of these can play in making restoration a success in the Indian context. Starting with policymakers, I think we sorely need an ecosystem restoration policy in India. We have a forest policy in India, which covers terrestrial forests. It does not cover other ecosystem types. And even the forest policy makes only a superficial reference to restoration. So we need a very dedicated ecosystem restoration policy, which clearly sets out the goals of restoration in India for the next 2 or 3 decades. What is the strategy that we're going to adopt to achieve this? What are the guidelines? Who will be responsible for what? And also the measurable targets over the next 2 to 3 decades, maybe split into 5-year blocks. And I also feel that a separate ecosystem restoration authority, similar to the National Biodiversity Authority, will help a lot in taking this entire effort forward. As part of the policy, we also need an inventory of ecosystem degradation. We can start at the state level and then get consolidated at the national level. And this inventory will help us to set restoration priorities because the time and resources available for ecological restoration are very limited. Therefore, we need to make sure that we prioritize our efforts on the most critical degradation areas. And for this, we can use certain criteria. I have listed what came to my mind. The first is those ecosystems that are very critical for the provision of key ecosystem services like water security, disaster prevention, etc. Areas with high biodiversity value, example, World Heritage sites like the Western Ghats or the Northeast. Ecosystems with high interconnectedness. So there is a lot of gene flow happening, and the interconnectivity is very important for biodiversity. Moving on to the scientific community, we may need a shift in balance of our research efforts from basic to applied research, focused on field examples. I'll give an example. Scaling up is a major challenge for restoration practitioners like me, because it's not at all easy to scale up. So I would like researchers to tell me, how do we optimize scale? At what level of scale do we retain the effectiveness of restoration and at the same time achieve a larger scale? So that is something that I would like research to inform me. Low-cost restoration methods, again, very important if we want to scale up. And lastly, how do we monitor large restoration sites? It's not easy to monitor the outcomes on large restoration sites. We also need to align research with themes that are strategically important from a long-term point of view. The first is to establish the carbon sequestration potential of restored ecosystems. I said forest, but we can say it as ecosystems because increasingly funding agencies are asking for evidence that restored ecosystems sequester more carbon than artificial plantations. So if we're able to prove this, a lot of carbon funding can actually get channelized into restoration. And the ecosystem service potential of restored ecosystems again needs to come out of research. It is not very, while we all say that biodiverse areas are better at providing ecosystem services, hard evidence is not easy to come by. And this kind of evidence is important if we want to influence external stakeholders, whether it's industry bodies or it's the government agencies. We need the evidence to influence them. The research can also focus on efficacy of low-cost natural approaches for restoration. This is a good example of aligning research with strategic themes. I give the example of assisted natural regeneration because this is an approach or methodology that we follow in our restoration efforts in Bandipur. If you look at most of the international standards and guidelines, they recommend assisted natural regeneration only in the case of mild degradation and where there is remnant native vegetation or there is potential for seeds to come in from nearby areas. However, there is strong emerging evidence from around the world where many practitioners, experienced practitioners are saying that ANR is effective also in sites with high degradation. However, if you look at research material available, there is hardly any research which compares ANR with active intervention. So this kind of limits the wider adoption of lower cost restoration approaches. Research also has to help restoration stay ahead of the degradation curve by addressing emerging challenges. I will give a case study here. Over the last 5 to 6 years, we are having rapid colonization in the Nilgiri biosphere area by a new invasive species called Senna spectabilis. It's again from South America. And it is far more invasive and far more damaging to the ecosystem than Lantana camara. However, there is hardly any research available or done till date on Senna spectabilis. And therefore, practitioners like me, we are trying out various experiments on small experimental plots, trying to see what works against Senna spectabilis. I wish there was enough research done over the last 5 to 6 years on Senna spectabilis instead of doing more and more research on Lantana camara, where there is more research than actual work on the ground. So absence of research creates a risk of delayed response. And by the time Senna spectabilis has spread over large areas. So it's really important for research to anticipate and stay ahead of the degradation curve. We also need to establish better feedback loops between research and practice because research happens over very small sample plots, which have limited ecological variations. And the influencing factors are also very limited, whereas practice is over much larger plots with higher variations and influencing factors. So this kind of feedback is very important so that we keep strengthening both the research and the practice. Going on to the education system, the key question for all of us in terms of education is who is the target audience? I feel that the external stakeholders are an important target audience for educating because they can play a very key role in influencing the way restoration is carried out in India. And how do we do this is a big challenge. We need to find avenues of communicating with them. These could be IAS officers, this could be members of the judiciary, it could be industry bodies. So we need to find ways of communicating with them. And we all need to get out of our comfort zone and start interacting with them because trust me, they all ask very, very difficult questions. So we need to have answers for those questions because they are the people who are going to influence many decisions which can impact restoration. Creating capacity for sound restoration project management, which is planning and implementation, is again a major challenge because we do not have many trained restorers in India. The reason for this is if you look at the West, if you look at North America or even Europe and Australia, most of the universities offer graduate and postgraduate programs exclusively on ecological restoration. But ecological restoration is not part of educational curriculum in most universities and institutions in India. And this includes institutions which are into conservation education. Some colleges have a paper on ecological restoration as part of their environmental sciences program or biodiversity conservation programs, but nobody has a full-fledged program on ecological restoration. So we're not able to have trained people coming out of our education system for the resources that are required for restoration. There are very limited field experience possibilities because I said earlier, there are not too many projects in India and there are not too many career opportunities also for people to take up restoration as a career. So how can we address these challenges? The first is in the medium term of 3 to 5 years, more universities have to offer graduate and postgraduate programs on ecological restoration. It is not easy to find faculty for these type of courses within India. So I think these universities can collaborate with international universities which are already offering programs on restoration. In the short term, we also need certification courses like the one BNCA is running now along with SCR. And we also need to create more internship opportunities for gaining field experience. And since opportunities are limited in India, we should look at international opportunities, preferably within the Asian region. Restoration also requires a number of well-trained field personnel who take care of all the field activities. And these are generally people from local areas who might be at a much lower education level, like +2 at the school level. And we need to create or curate modules for training of these people based on local context and based on hands-on and experiential learning. Moving on to restoration practitioners, it is very important for anybody who is aspiring to become an ecological restoration practitioner to recognize that restoration is a specialized discipline and it requires distinct knowledge and skills. And it's not that everybody can jump into restoration and start doing restoration on the ground. It is not advisable to do that. And therefore, it's important to restorers to acquire the necessary knowledge of restoration principles, standards, and approaches. And formal training and certification will go a long way in making sure that projects are actually run by people with the right background. Field experience, as I said earlier, is very important. It takes 5 to 10 years for somebody to gain a reasonable understanding of what works in the field. So field experience is crucial, and collaboration amongst the restoration community is also very important for sharing knowledge and reducing the learning curve. I wish more collaborations happen between restoration practitioners within India. That will create a lot of synergy and also a lot of energy and information sharing. Scaling up is a very major challenge because, as I said earlier, most of the projects in India are very small in size. I'm not including the massive tree planting drives, which are not ecological restoration in my view. So we are, I have tried to present this in a small diagram. On the x-axis, you have the size of the projects, and on the y-axis, you have the level of integration at a landscape level. So we are currently at the bottom left-hand quadrant, which is a number of small projects which are not integrated with each other. They don't talk to each other. They're all standalone projects. Now we have two options if you want to scale up. Either we move to the bottom right-hand quadrant, where each of these projects gets more funding, becomes larger in size, but still continues to be standalone and not integrated. Or we move to the top left-hand quadrant, where we first try to integrate these small projects with each other at a landscape level. So if you're talking about the Western Ghats, we have the projects all integrated. So we have an inventory of all the restoration projects happening across the Western Ghats. We try to integrate them and seek the synergies that are possible between these projects. And then this could even become a consortium for fundraising as well. And then from there, we move on to scaling up these individual projects to a bigger size where they're already integrated. And this would be a much more sustainable model than projects trying to scale up individually. Indigenous knowledge, very important. We have been working with indigenous community members for the last 14 years in our management of Lantana Camara. It has been extremely productive and a very, very valuable partnership for us because they played a very key role in the success of the restoration projects. So if you look at our project to manage Lantana Camara, we use both scientific knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. The scientific knowledge gives us the conceptual framework. It helps us to understand the characteristics of the plant that we're trying to manage. How do we remove it? What are the post-removal restoration strategies to be adopted? And how do we manage secondary invasive species like Parthenium or Eupatorium? On the other hand, the traditional ecological knowledge gives us in-depth knowledge of the site level abiotic and environmental conditions, because these are people who have lived there for several decades and they know the layout of the forest in and out. They also have excellent knowledge of native flora and how do we propagate these native flora. And they have very good knowledge of the food chain, which is the flora fauna association. So you can see how these two knowledge streams are complementary, but each is distinct in its own way. Now, moving on to climate change managers. Climate change is one of the major threats to biodiversity, as we all know. Everybody is saying global warming is going to lead to a lot of loss of species. However, I personally feel that climate change management or mitigation is also a big threat to biodiversity, because they are planning to plant trees wherever there's an open piece of land, and this is going to destroy a lot of unique native ecosystems. It is important that climate change managers recognize that a wide array of ecosystems can sequester carbon. Many of them can sequester more carbon than even terrestrial forests. So we've got aquatic ecosystems, intermediate ecosystems like wetlands, which can sequester a lot of carbon. And then we have the terrestrial ecosystems. Not all of them have tree cover. So it's very important to recognize that you need a wide diversity of ecosystems if you want to sequester the maximum amount of carbon. But by focusing excessively on tree planting, we are missing out on leveraging the total sequestration potential that we have. Climate change managers also have to recognize that biological diversity is very important for carbon sequestration, because research evidence is showing that species richness and structural diversity both have a positive correlation with both above and below ground carbon storage. And there is also evidence which is emerging that shows that increased trophic cascade leads to higher carbon fixation in plants. So this provides us a strong case for changing the focus from tree planting drives to scientific ecological restoration efforts that help the revival of biodiverse landscapes. One of the major challenges for climate change managers is not just carbon sequestration, but how do we manage the adverse impacts of climate change? So climate change is leading to severe droughts, as we are seeing in Africa. It is leading to severe floods and cyclones, as we have seen in many parts of India. So we all know that unique ecosystems like shola grasslands can help in providing greater water security, and mangroves can provide protection against cyclones. We all know that. But I want to highlight an important outcome of global warming, which is massive fires, which are happening all over the world now. They're massive fires. And this is where the climate change managers have to change their approach from artificial plantations. Like you see on the bottom left figure, there's an artificial plantation of multiple trees because they expect that more trees will sequester more carbon. But then these also run the very high risk of massive forest fires and release of huge quantities of carbon within a very short period of time. So you might succeed in sequestering some carbon, but there is one fire and the entire thing gets released into the atmosphere. Whereas if you see the picture on the bottom right, which is a diverse ecosystem, which got trees, it's got water bodies, it's got swamps, it's got grasslands. So there are natural fire breaks available here. So it's very difficult for a fire to become a very large scale fire in this kind of a scenario. So actually a diverse ecosystem like this is helping you to prevent forest fires and the release of carbon into the atmosphere. Moving on to funding agencies, lastly, funding agencies play a very, very key role in ecological restoration, because it's a fairly resource intensive activity. And for funding agencies, this is a very new kind of activity. It is not the usual kind of activity that they undertake in the areas of health and education, where it is fairly straightforward. First and foremost, funding agencies have to recognize that ecological restoration is a long-term activity. So restoring a particular site might take anywhere from 5 to 20 years. So it's a very long-term activity, and they need to be able to support the activity for a very long period of time. This is a big challenge because most funding agencies are looking at the short term. The CSR agencies are looking at 1 year. Some are looking at 3 years, but they need to start looking at the longer term. They need to fund genuine and sound restoration projects rather than funding. There's a lot of money going into unscientific approaches. Therefore, they need to fund genuine and sound restoration projects based on proof of concept. They need to look at funding projects that are a priority from biodiversity of ecosystem or ecosystem service perspective. We talked earlier about setting priorities for restoration. So the funding agencies also have to be aligned with those priorities. And most importantly, the monitoring protocols have to be non-linear. In the case of education or health, they give money to somebody to put 100 beds in a hospital. It's a very linear kind of monitoring. So you just see whether the 100 beds have been installed or not, but it is not that easy in a restoration project. So they need to be aware that monitoring protocols have to be specifically designed for ecological restoration projects. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions, please.
Thank you, Ramesh sir. There is one question in the chat box by architect Amreshwari Rajendran. She says it is really an insightful presentation. Please do explain how, in case of urban river ecology, restoration research process should be carried out.
I think most of the river restoration projects are now basically focusing on cleaning up of the rivers or dredging of the rivers, etc. Whereas if you want to follow a restoration-based approach, you'll have to look at the entire flow of the river right from the catchment area to where it kind of drains into the sea, because you cannot restore only a small part of the river which is running through a particular city. So it's a multifaceted and one of the most challenging restoration scenarios is river restoration. So you'll have to look at improving the entire flow of the river, also the water quality, managing effluents, making sure that the biodiversity of the river comes back, the fauna and flora in the river comes back. All those aspects have to be brought in.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think we will again meet you at the panel discussion where we can interact with you again. Thank you very much.
Sir. Can we take one more question?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there is another question by Piyush sir. What do you think is the role of events like this one? How can we be more effective? And also there is one question from Shishir Rawar. He says, thank you for this comprehensive presentation. Please elaborate on the principle of optimal intervention.
First, answer Piyush's question. I think events like these are very important in creating awareness amongst a wide cross-section of participants. And secondly, also to understand the roles of various stakeholders in ecological restoration, because otherwise the onus of carrying out restoration is entirely on restoration practitioners. But it is important to realize that there are multiple people who have to play a role in restoration for this entire process to be successful. So that is my in the beginning, Swatiji said there are academicians here, there are people from educational institutions, etc. So all of them can play a very key role in the success of restoration efforts in India. Secondly, to answer Shishirji's question, what I meant by optimal intervention is that we don't over intervene or do excessive efforts more than what is required for the recovery of the basic ecosystem functions. And once we observe the ecosystem functions coming back, we largely leave it to nature to recover. So it's not that we go about doing excessive restoration on a site, because it is, even research is proving now that every site has its own recovery potential. For example, there is a native seed bank in every site. And when you go and plant a number of saplings on that particular site, it kind of suppresses that native seed bank. So native seed banks do not get an opportunity to germinate and establish, because you planted a lot of saplings on that particular site. So intervention always has to be optimal to the situation.
Okay, thank you, sir.